everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Natalie Shaver, and I'm the Content Marketing Manager here at Pharos. I'm joined today by Pharos Executive Chairman Kevin Pickhardt and Assistant Vice President at U.S. Bank Chris J. Green. In today's webinar, we'll be discussing how U.S. Bank successfully migrated their print infrastructure to the cloud and transformed a fragmented, high-maintenance environment into a streamlined, secure, and user-friendly service. But before we begin, I just want to cover a couple of housekeeping items. First, we are recording this webinar. You'll be receiving an email with the recording link as well as the presentation shortly after it concludes, so you can rewatch at your convenience or share with a colleague. Second, we will have a Q&A session at the end. So if you do have any questions, please submit them and we'll be sure to answer as many as we can. In today's session, we'll discuss how U.S. Bank approached cloud migration for print across thousands of users and locations, the challenges they faced and how they overcame them, the impact on IT operations, security, and the digital employee experience, and practical lessons and strategies you can apply to your own cloud modernization journey. Before we get into our discussion, I want to first introduce our moderator and speakers. Our moderator today is Kevin Pickhardt. Kevin is the executive chairman of Pharos, where he first served, as the CEO for more than 24 years. He's taken a hands-on approach and has deep relationships with many of our customers, helping them navigate technology shifts and change. Thank you for joining us today, Kevin.
Thanks, Natalie.
Our featured speaker today is Chris Green. Chris is an assistant vice president at U.S. Bank, where he leads strategic initiatives in IT infrastructure and digital modernization. He brings deep experience in enterprise, technology, and operations, including guiding the migration of print environments to cloud-native solutions that improve security, reliability, and efficiency at scale. Happy to have you today, Chris. Kevin, I'll let you take it from here.
Excellent. Thanks, Natalie. And Chris, I'm thrilled to join you today and have the opportunity to talk to you and learn a little bit more about the U.S. Bank experience in your modernization and migration to the cloud. I know Natalie gave a quick intro, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about your role and as well as the experience of U.S. Bank, and I know you've got a couple of slides prepared for us to go through. So would you care to walk us through?
Absolutely, Kevin, and thank you guys so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today. Part of what we've experienced with our implementation of HP Secure Print is, we've reduced our printer fleet by 40%. We've enhanced our security, and we've also just in the first year that we had it, we reduced printing by 6 million pages. So yeah, we're really excited, and we're really seeing some benefits.
Yeah, those are fantastic and enviable results, Chris. I'm sure a lot of the people listening would love to be able to repeat those and accomplish what U.S. Bank has accomplished. It looks like a key part of that initiative was to modernize your IT infrastructure, and by shifting the print into the cloud. So can you help elaborate on what you did in terms of and what you saw that drove that shift into the cloud for U.S. Bank?
Sure. Well, for us, sometime around 2020, our bank adopted a cloud-first strategy. So whether leveraging software as a cloud solutions with vendor partners like Microsoft and ServiceNow, or using Microsoft Azure and Amazon AWS to move our infrastructure to US Bank hosted solutions. We were looking at that, and we're also always continuously trying to improve our security and risk posture, since we're a financial institution. And we decided to work with our corporate procurement on an RFP for a new managed print program at the bank. We had several different things that we were trying to accomplish with that. We wanted to get to a single managed print service provider. We had multiple at the time. We wanted to right size our fleet because we had sprawl just kind of over time. So we really wanted to address that. We wanted to get our printers into a true 4 year life cycle as opposed to, we had printers at the time that were over 10 years old. We wanted to bring some cohesion to our printer experience. We had printers of various makes and models. So we wanted to have a single experience with printing and using those devices. We wanted to establish a pull print solution to just modernize the way that we were printing at the bank and to increase our security. We wanted to reduce our IT footprint and retire some of our legacy on-prem servers that we had. We wanted to reduce calls to our service desk. So all of that, when HP came to the table with HP Secure Print, with their cloud software as a service, it was just the right time, and we were really interested to hear more about that and what that had to offer for us.
Excellent. I know, and I think Natalie also has a slide on what Pharos has been hearing from other enterprise clients who are looking at shifting to the cloud. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on this because I think you touched on just about everything on this slide about how to create consistency and how to eliminate your infrastructure, in particular your print drivers, security being a key focus, mobile and hybrid workers, enhanced uptime and scalability, optimizing the printer fleet. A lot of what I think US Bank has gone through are similar types of things to what we've seen from many of our existing clients. One of the things that we also see is this the support for mobile and hybrid workers, and there's been a lot in that space in the last several years. Where did that sit on the priority list for you and US Bank?
Well, for us in particular, I do know that we have some mobile. We do support mobile users at the bank, but for us, printing really isn't much of an issue for those users. We have solutions that can accommodate our home-based users, but for the most part, most of our printing happens in our office. So our hybrid users are used to doing the printing when they're on those office days.
Gotcha. And from our experience, an organization the size of US Bank, and especially one in the financial services industry, you guys are pretty early in this shift of, at least shift of printing infrastructure into the cloud. Can you walk us through the decision that you went through at US Bank? Who was involved in that decision? How did you make the decision to shift that infrastructure to the cloud? And what are the hurdles that you guys have experienced in doing so?
Yeah, so we partnered with our corporate procurement teams, with our ISS partners, our risk partners, and other IT leaders in various stacks throughout our IT infrastructure at the bank to really look at, how this was all going to make sense. And then, once we made a decision to implement, some of the challenges that we run into moving things from our on-prem infrastructure to the cloud, has to do with the fact that we're turning that over to another group that we're trusting to, keep our stuff up and running. So when when those unfortunate outages occur, they are rare, but when they occur, it's really important that we're working with our vendor partners to help us understand what's going on and what's being done to resolve that. There's less people internally that we can push on to, to bring those systems back online and get us those information. So it's you have to have some trust there, and you have to work with your partners to get the updates.
Yeah, it's a bit of a leap of faith moving from having everything completely under your control to now that kind of level of trust and work with third parties and partners, and I know that's got to be tricky to take that first leap. but over time, building that relationship hopefully ends up saving you and your organization time and effort in the long run.
Yep,
Having somebody else who's there to manage those elements.
definitely.
Chris, what would you do differently, if anything, from your experience?
I don't think that there's much that we would do differently. Obviously, we know more now. I just think that you have to be prepared as you can be. Um, you know, uh, I think that our transition went well. It took a long time to get there. We had almost 3 years to get through our RFP, thanks to the pandemic, and then we had 18 months of implementation. So, um, from the decision to make the change to implement everything took quite a while. So we were able to learn and iterate and go slowly and do change our design as we went. So that was helpful. Not doing it too fast.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. So it sounds like in some ways the challenge of going through the pandemic and changing infrastructure during that time was both a plus and a minus. Might
Yeah,
have been good in that you had less demand on that infrastructure. You had the time to go in and do that without the normal stress that would normally
right.
be on your printing infrastructure.
Yeah.
Um, so talk to us. Print is an end user service, and you mentioned a little bit earlier on that there are changes that impact your end users. What have you seen, and what has been the experience of your end users and the team that supports them as you've put in this new infrastructure and printing solution alongside HP?
Well, we definitely learned a lot along the way, not just about the product, but how cloud works, and as far as the satisfaction goes, we made a big change here at the bank. We went from using some kind of legacy rudimentary printing to this whole change to pull print, where people were badging in and releasing their print jobs and that type of thing. So it took quite a bit of communication and just time to work with our end users on a very large change. And even as we went through the change, we would continually learn new things about printing behaviors and what worked for some groups and what didn't. And so we've even after we fully transitioned to a pull print, where we're using HP Secure Print to badge in and release jobs at the printers, to where we've used a feature within Secure Print called Direct Print to allow that push print capability back again for groups that need that. So it's just kind of a continual learning experience and getting better as we go.
Yeah, Chris, I know I had a conversation with an executive at another bank where we were implementing that pull print methodology, um, and he kind of explained it that from their perspective, it was all of their end users were angry about a change until they got used to it, and then as soon as he said, "Okay, we're going to go back," they said, "No, we're not going back.
Right.
We like the new world, but we don't like change."
Yep.
And it sounds like your experience similar.
It is. It's definitely similar. I mean, there's definitely people who absolutely love it, and there's some people that, like you said, are just kind of a little resistant to change. But we're able to work with them, and I think everyone's in a much better position now than they were when we started. So
Excellent, excellent. And I know that Natalie is collecting questions that have come in from people, and I want to make sure that we have a chance to answer um, some of those. And you, Chris, will get the last word before we get there. But you've been through this now. What advice would you give to other organizations that are looking to make this decision?
yeah, I just would really stress that making a switch to this isn't just something within your IT stack. You really should work with lots of different areas of your company, your ISS people, your risk people, your corporate procurement folks, and really do a cost analysis, a use case analysis, and look at the technical the technical things within your stack that may make cloud printing more difficult or easier. Just really analyze all that stuff before you make a decision uh, to to change like we did, especially a large change like this, and just be prepared for little setbacks along the way. You have to be flexible and you have to be willing to adapt and change.
Yeah, Chris, you make a really good point. I think a lot of people, because print has been around as long as it has, um, a lot of people take for granted that it just is there and
Hmm.
that printers exist on the network as these end devices, without really thinking about all of the plumbing that it takes to
Yep.
keep those devices running and to have the communication flow from end users through those devices in an encrypted, secure way. It really is
Yep.
a broad initiative that touches many parts of the IT fabric. So, really good advice to make sure that you do that. And I think we've got one more slide because you mentioned a few times you work with Hewlett Packard and in particularly HP Secure Print and Insights. And for people on the call who are not familiar with that particular offering from HP, this is a cloud-based service that is powered by Pharos, but in partnership with Hewlett Packard and obviously Chris now with you and your team. But HP is a cloud-based um, global platform designed to manage all of the different elements associated with that print infrastructure of what we're talking about, from security to pull printing or secure printing. You mentioned direct printing. How do print files get from anywhere to any device in the enterprise securely, efficiently, and managed in a way that we understand the identity of the users making their way through it, and just making sure that print is not just efficient and smooth and easy, but that it's secured and tracked. And HP's got a full-fledged system and cloud system for doing that, which you guys have been running on. So, Chris, really enjoyed speaking with you today, and I'm gonna turn it over to Natalie to take us through any questions that have popped up.
Thanks, Kevin. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to share your perspectives and insights today. It was really informative. You touched on a lot of challenges and the impacts of migrating that has helped US Bank specifically, and I'm sure that the attendees have some questions. So at this point, we'll move forward into our Q&A portion of the webinar. And let me check here. Yes, we have a few that came in. Okay, the first question is, what risks do organizations face when print infrastructure is left out of broader cloud and modernization efforts?
Well, I think it's you know printing is it's just a way of having output out there. So it's like Kevin mentioned, it's often overlooked. So it's an important aspect of any company's way of distributing information. So when you're dealing with something that can be spit out at somebody's desk or at a floor printer and just leaves, you really have to take into um, consideration, all of the risk aspects around that. And so whether it's in encrypting that information at rest or in transit, getting it safely and securely to the printer, and then even after it gets to the printer, making sure people are aware of what they should be doing with that print and where they should be depositing it if it needs to be shredded, all that kind of stuff. It is really things that need to be thought out and not just overlooked and missed.
Chris, I may add to that because your answer is kind of spot on. The other thing I think that's been going on is that print the overall print infrastructure and the way that print works with print drivers and print queues in today's world have not necessarily kept pace with a lot of the new architecture and technology, things like zero trust and things like cloud that you're making your way through. And I know that Microsoft and others are going through the process of looking at that architecture for print and making shifts and changes to it. So, one of one of the risks that I think you guys have gotten out ahead of at US Bank is um, if you wait too long to take the modernization efforts in print, some of these architectural changes, like what Windows is doing with Windows protected print mode, are going to show up and begin to force your hand. And nobody really wants you. You were talking about the challenge and the length of time to user change, infrastructure change, and deploy these things. Much better to do it on your own terms than to wait and be forced by architectural changes or security changes, creating that change and forcing it overnight.
Yep, absolutely.
Great. The next question is, print is not often a top priority for senior leadership. What metrics or outcomes resonated most when making the case at US Bank?
Well, I can tell you that we talked earlier in the slide. We had a 6 million page decrease the first year. I was super excited um, to share with leadership that last year, it was 18 million pages that we saved year over year, and it's largely because we moved to the pull print solution. And so it's really nice to be able to say at least even after you've implemented, like, hey, we're seeing real value here, and whether it's those click charges or page charges, or the cost of paper and toner and all that kind of stuff. That's what senior leadership likes to see. They like to see that we're making improvements and we're saving money. So definitely will pay off.
Chris, I've got a kind of a follow up to that because we see this with others. Did you run into the case of any of your senior leaders saying they don't, print is not really critical? It's a legacy technology. It's not. It's becoming secondary. It's not core to the enterprise anymore. Did you see that at US Bank with your senior leadership?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, they're reviewing that all the time. So yeah, we definitely see that, Kevin.
Yeah. And what are you finding? Are you finding? I mean, is there anywhere where you are going printerless?
Um, I'm sorry, you're talking about just shifting to digital and
No,
things like that?
no printers, right? No
Yeah,
printing as a yeah.
yeah, it's more and more shifting to digital, and doing digital workflow is it may not be top of mind, but it's in conversations where it didn't used to be before. And so
Mm.
there's definitely more of an appetite to see how we can bring in different technologies to shift that output from paper, to digital, and you know that's what we want to do. We want to eventually have less printers. Sorry, HP, but that's the end goal, is to reduce printing.
Yeah.
Great. The next question is, what advice would you give to IT leaders who know they need to act but are unsure where to begin?
Um, that's a great question. You know, uh, I would just say, from my own experience, going through this RFP process where we had different vendors coming in and presenting what they can do, was very helpful to see, because if you're not exposed to a lot of different manufacturers and the products, and what they can do for you in the space of printing, you might get locked into one certain style. So it's good to broaden your horizons. And then I would say, if there's any kind of peer groups that you can involve yourself in, I have definitely seen the impact of that here at US Bank, where we've reached out to our partners, whether it's in the financial space or just other large businesses, to talk about IT. It's great to have that kind of community where you can bounce questions off of each other.
Great. What did the
Excellent.
rollout process look like across such a large organization? How do you phase the deployment to minimize disruption?
Well, yeah, that took quite a bit of planning to do, for for our company, again, we rolled out to about 2,300 sites in about 18 months. So in our case, it worked out good for us to concentrate our rollout in areas where we had the most printers, and in that way, we were able to tackle most of our fleet in the first 6 months, and then the last 12 months just kept going down in size. So it's going to depend on how your operations go, how you're laid out geographically. But it took many weeks of trying to put that together and working with our partners at HP to figure out what worked best for us.
Great. This is a good one. How did migrating print to the cloud impact your security and compliance posture, especially in a regulated environment like banking?
Yeah, so that's something that we're constantly being looked at from regulatory and audit requirements to make sure that we have our printers properly locked down and that we're controlling that print stream. And so again, that kind of talks into making sure that your solution has those controls in place to secure your data while it's being stored, while it's in transit, controlling what happens to the print job after it comes out of the printer. So I would say in addition to that, with our switch over to secure print, we do have much better metrics on our print, what our individual users are doing on a daily basis than we had before. So that's been another positive change is we just have much better visibility to what's happening in print, and that's helpful from a risk and audit perspective.
Chris, one of the things that I'll add to that, when you look at from a cloud infrastructure standpoint, the organizations that are shifting to zero trust architectures or zero trust security really require you to look at print differently and how you manage access and cloud-based solutions are kind of designed for how you can support zero trust in a security world and in a print world. And traditional print is not designed for that zero trust security. So for people who are being security conscious, you've got that on the one hand, what you mentioned earlier, partnering with somebody in the cloud where you're really having trust in their environment and their security. At the same time, when you do that, it can enable dramatically improved security, endpoint security from desktop to device. So it's something, if you're thinking about heading down this path, it's something that you really need to be asking your providers about how they handle security and in particular zero trust for printing.
Great. Okay, I think our one of the last questions we have is how did you approach change management and communication with employees to ensure adoption of the new print system?
Yeah, so in our case, we worked really hard with again with our partners at HP to develop the story about why we're making this big change and how it was going to help people. Eventually not only make us more secure as a company, but provide some enhanced capabilities that they didn't have, and really just sell that as the positive things. And so we talked a little bit before about making the change and stuff. And a lot of the people, for example, got excited when we told them like with the pull print solution, you can just print and you can walk to any printer in the building. So, and then you can release the job at that printer. And that was something that was really appealing to certain segments of our business. But I'd say overall, it takes some careful planning about how you're going to roll out the communications and when you're going to provide different communications throughout the process. And then with our implementation of this, it coincided with refreshed hardware deployment. So it wasn't just changing how we print. This rolled out site by site, was saying we're going to come into your branch at this day and time, and we're going to give you new printers, and we're going to give you this new way to print. And here's all these great ways that you can get more information on this. Here's some self-help videos that we did. I mean, there were lots of different ways that we worked with them to communicate in lots of different places. I mean, whether it's our homepage or emails or different ways that we have to send out communication to the company, just trying to tailor that to different parts of our company and how they ingest information. Um, and all of this to say there was a lot that went into, you know, celebrating the change and then rolling it out and communicating it out as best as we could.
Chris, it looked like there's a good follow-on question. It sounds like it came from a financial services person on online here, and it fits into that, which is the workflow in the branches. If you know, the question is, are your tellers in your branches using secure print, pull print, or direct print? How did that get rolled out to the branches, and in particular that direct customer facing role?
Yeah, so in our case, we did roll out everything with secure print, where that's the pull, what we call secure. When we say secure print, we're just talking about the pull print solution. So we rolled that out initially, and we have added this direct print capability. So we're actually giving users a choice, and we're kind of we're newly into this direct print capability that we've given our users. So we're early into it so far. We've got some people, again, just from a change perspective, some people really love the HP Secure Print um, methodology where they're pulling print, and we have other users that are just loving the direct print capability and being able to pick up those jobs on the printer. So we've rolled out both, and both are working well.
Good.
Great. And then I just have one more question for both of you that I'm just interested to know. Are there any emerging trends in print management or workplace technology that really excite you, especially in the coming year, 2026?
Kevin, I'll let you take that one.
Um, sure. So yeah, there's a couple things that both excite me and make me a little bit nervous in this space that we see coming in 2026, and we have some other communications and items on this. One in particular is what we see going on in the security space with Microsoft and Windows Protected Print Mode, um, fundamentally changing the architecture of how print is done. Apple has done this several years ago, um, but as Microsoft shifts the nature and architecture of print drivers and print queues in the operating systems, which they're going to continually do in the upcoming 2026, 27 timeframe, all organizations are going to have to come to grips with how do we deal with that new architected world. I happen to think it's the right direction. Microsoft is going that direction very specifically because of security and security concerns that they have. So I think Microsoft's heading the right direction. But they're putting a challenge out there for all of us in this print space for how we stay ahead of that. And that one certainly has my focus in the next 12 to 24 months. How about you, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I want to learn more about Windows Protected Print myself, and dive more into that. But other than that, we're just we're continuing to just mature in the space where that we're at currently. So that's really our focus. It's just again maturing our current processes, and then always just trying to see how we can print less as an organization, drive down costs.
Great, thank you. At this point, I don't see any additional questions, so we'll start wrapping up. Chris, thank you again for participating and sharing your experience with US Bank. We really appreciate having you here today. It's very appreciated. For those in the audience, thank you for taking time to join our session. We hope you found it informative. And just as a reminder, you'll receive an email soon with the link to the webinar recording as well as this presentation. And the presentation includes a few links to some resources you might find helpful. So if you're interested in learning more, please reach out to your Pharos account representative. And with that said, thank you again for your time, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. Thanks, Chris.
Yep. Thanks, Kevin. Bye bye.